You're listening to the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT podcast. I'm your host and curator, Rabbi Abram Kibalevich, and I hope you enjoy this episode.
Where are the aisles? The projectionist asks Micha. Hi, I'm here with Yitzchak Kolakowski, and we're here to explore a genre which it's, sort of, it's like shooting fish in a barrel because there's so many of these films. And all of them sort of have an inbred likability factor. And these are, I would call the boxing films, pugilistic films, films about people trying to make it as a boxer or aspire to take the heavyweight championship or something like that. They're, whether it's the heavyweight or lightweight or welterweight, it probably numbers in the hundreds and hundreds of films where boxing was a key element in these films. And there are some, Yitzchak, that you have to say are sort of like towering classics of the genre that everybody knows, whether it's John Garfield, we mentioned last week, in Body and Soul, Kirk Douglas in Champion, or probably what's the most celebrated, beautiful boxing film, Raging Bull, Martin Scorsese's Raging Bull. But I discovered a boxing film that I really was not that aware of. And I have to tell you, watching it, I think it probably, in my mind, and that's, including Rocky and all these other films that people, Cinderella Man and so many other celebrated films that people love so much and that spawned sequels like Creed and Rocky. It's Gentleman Jim. And it was a favorite films of its star, Errol Flynn. Now, I talked about Errol Flynn a couple of weeks ago, you might remember, in Footsteps in the Dark, which was a flop. This film actually was very popular. And even though Errol was not in an old-fashioned costumes like Robin Hood or some sort of swashbuckling way or playing a cowboy of the Old West, he was still playing a figure out of history. He was playing Jim Corbett. The film was made in 1942. The director was someone that he really loved, Raoul Walsh. It seems like the director that I talked about last week on The Seawolf, Michael Curtis, was someone that had worked with Errol Flynn, and Flynn and he did not get along. Raoul Walsh became one of Flynn's favorite directors, and this film also has someone who became one of Flynn's favorite co-stars, was Alexis Smith. Most people know Yitzchak Flynn from his swashbuckling Robin Hood and adventures with his co-star, or Captain Blood, his co-star Olivia de Havilland, and they were sort of like a team in Hollywood. But I think, although I'm not so sure about this, I think he actually enjoyed working with the younger Alexis Smith more, although she definitely doesn't have the acting chops of Olivia de Havilland or Joan Fontaine, her sister, but she seemed to be perfect in terms of the chemistry between her and Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn loved this film because, in a way, it was a story, something about him. He was also sort of a scalawag and a guy who was sort of like pushing himself larger than life, the same way Jim Corbett was. The film is based somewhat on Jim Corbett's fanciful biography of himself. In those days, everybody promoted lies all about themselves, whether they were famous authors or famous boxers or everyone. So unlike the film I talked about last week, where I talked about the heavy burden of trying to stay loyal to a famous book with characters, the screenwriters were able to do whatever they wanted with Gentleman Jim. They could play loose with the facts as much as possible. The one thing that had to be constant was the great standoff between Jim Corbett and John L. Sullivan. Again, this was, of course, a time that the Irish were not only the most numerous immigrants, but in many ways were so colorful in terms of what they were doing, in terms of putting their imprint on American life. Flynn, of course, was an Australian, but he had boxed as a young person. And one of the things that many of his biographers speak about was that he enjoyed this film because he also did most of the stunts. Whereas in many films, and even Flynn's later films, you can see that it's some stuntman. Here, he actually took his shirt off and was dancing around the ring and actually read up on Sullivan's techniques and tried to actually give them a real embodiment.
Did he box kangaroos in Australia?
Well, he definitely was agile, Yitzchak, and I don't know if he was too successful of a boxer, but as we're going to be talking about, boxing in many ways was sort of like the way we would talk about a paper route or a kid flipping burgers as sort of the way you broke through intense poverty to actually get your first job and first chance at some sort of money. And I think many actors and people of girth and strength, like Errol Flynn, start out that way. So this was, but also what he loved about the film was because Jim Corbett sold himself. James Corbett was selling himself. In fact, what the film has so much fun with is how these boxers moonlighted as media stars. And Corbett was a very handsome man, and this was a time that still photography and actually the embryonic movie industry took note. And there were a number of films, although I can't tell you exactly, but there are actually some films that still remain of actual footage, silent of course, of Gentleman Jim Corbett in the ring. So these were the celebrities, and the film does a great job of capturing that spirit. It starts in San Francisco, and it actually has a lot of fun with the fact that although boxing was outlawed in many states, and part of the reason was because of its violent nature, everybody wanted a part of it, even the judges and most aristocratic citizens. Now, of course, the movie makes sure to let you know that in California, today's aristocrat was yesterday's stowaway on some sort of caravan, or some gold digger, or some guy, or a gold digger, or somebody who was prospecting, because it's almost like it was the American dream, where everybody, you can become someone. And part of what drives Gentleman Jim Corbett and this character in the film is to get into that society of the Olympic Club and to actually show himself. And Errol Flynn doesn't mind being sort of an obnoxious fellow. And they all talk about him being obnoxious, like the other people who want him to be showed up. And Flynn was also known as a very brash, obnoxious guy. So he didn't mind playing this character that really aligned so much with who he was. On the other hand, the film works as a comedy, unlike a lot of the boxing films. Now, Rocky, of course, which I guess you've seen, does have a lot of comic elements, with Stallone and sort of developing as a human being. And I would say a lot of sophomoric elements in terms of course, Burgess Meredith, who plays his Jewish coach. This film really retains such a high spirit. Now, I told you again, it was probably produced before America entered into war. But unlike other films that we've talked about, that it was sort of, there were subliminal messages about, the American life, and sort of like there were semi-propaganda films for why we should accept war. This movie is just a good time. Raoul Walsh stages a number of incredible scenes where they're fighting on Fisherman's Wharf in some place on the water, and he does great work with his crane shots. And he also, the casting, besides Alexis Smith, who plays sort of this this woman of who has money, who in a way Corbett or Errol Flynn wants to try to impress, and constantly bumps into. And that's sort of like they play off of each other as sort of rivals, not rivals, but a nemesis of one to the other. But clearly there's a tremendous attraction between them. There's also a number of I would say, sort of some stock Warner players. Jack Carson. Now, Jack Carson was a really super successful second banana in a number of films. Many people remember him from A Star Is Born and Mildred Pierce, where he sort of had his largest role playing opposite Joan Crawford. But he usually was cast as sort of like the semi-likable schlubby guy who was sort of the best friend of the hero. And he does a very fine job here. And in fact, part of the charm of the Corbett character is that despite how gauche and uncouth the Carson character is, and the Gentleman Jim knows how to dance around not only the ring but can also impress people, he stands up for his buddy and won't let his buddy be pushed around and be considered someone not worthy. And there's a number of great scenes of friendship and understanding between them. And in many ways, Carson, has a mean streak in some of the other films that he was within, The Strawberry Blonde with James Cagney, and some other films where you see his nice guy becoming cruel. In this film, he just plays it as a super nice schlub. And, he just love having him around. Another lovable character is someone who I spoke about, if you remember, who was in Footsteps in the Dark, Alan Hale Sr., and in this film, Alan Hale plays Corbett's father. And along with a wife and two other brothers, again, whether these were really part of Corbett's family or not, the names I know were not correct. And they are this fighting Irish family, and he's got a livery stable. And, Alan Hale, there's Alan Hale does a couple of Irish jigs. And it's just wonderful to see him, and the chemistry that really exists between Alan Hale and almost all the other characters. It might be one of Alan Hale's. I think both Alan Hale and Jack Carson really, sort of, if they would want to have their Olam Haba Masechta, like what represented their greatness in the acting field, I would say this film is a great is a great exemplar for both of them. As far as that goes. So it's really fun watching them. The other character actor who I think might have had the role of his lifetime here, and again, I talked about Errol Flynn loving this role, was Ward Bond. Now, Ward Bond, you might know, was a staple of John Ford's Westerns. And he generally played a character of great humor, a character that didn't necessarily have everything in the mental department. But in other times, of course, I talked about the film that he played, where he played the Mormon leader, along with Ben Johnson, the film, John Ford film that we talked about a couple of months ago. Must be about a year or so ago. In this film, he plays John L. Sullivan. And he was clearly very well put together. But part of what the film is trying to underscore is that Sullivan represents old style boxing even before there were gloves, boxing that you were just punching and brawling, the boxing that got the women's league up in arms, the boxing that was considered brutal and horrible, that left people, beaten to a pulp. And the film really deals with the idea, although in a humorous way, how from Sullivan to Corbett, that Corbett unseating Sullivan as the heavyweight champ really meant that boxing was going into a different era, an era where grace and speed was more important than being a brawler. And as I said, Ward Bond inhabits that character. He inhabits him as a personality, as a celebrity. In fact, Alan Hale is so excited that he was able to shake the hand of John L. Sullivan. Now, all of this is it's fancifully done, but it's based on the truth that Sullivan was a national hero, John L. Sullivan, and as was Corbett. The climax of the film, of course, what it builds up to is the fact that as Corbett becomes more successful, and amazingly, he sort of ends up falling into the boxing arena. He's abetted by, when he wakes up drunk in Salt Lake City. It turns out, even though that's the home of the Mormons, I don't know what they were doing boxing there. Maybe I guess there was boxing going on anyway. But it turns out that Bill Frawley is there. Now, he, of course, is Fred Mertz from I Love Lucy. And here he is playing Corbett's manager, who gets him the fights, who's with him in the ring. And of course, unlike the film that I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, Footsteps in the Dark, where Frawley plays a complete idiot whose whole purpose is to just say stupid things, like he doesn't understand what's going on. In this film, Frawley also, it might be Frawley's best Hollywood role as well. He does have a role, as you might remember, in Miracle in 34. Frawley is Jack Delaney, I think is his name, another sort of an Irish guy who's involved in managing Corbett. And he actually has a chen to him. So I have to say that it really is a film that goes by quickly. And even though you sort of know what's going to happen, it really, in a way, avoided some of the later tropes of some of these boxing films. In terms of, the tropes of, he got beaten and he had to learn his lesson, and he had to change, or something like that. Many films where the success is going to spoil him, and he's got to learn his lesson, and he has to have humility, and it also has some pretty exciting scenes of boxing. There's a Polish fighter. It seems like he fights in the middle before he gets to John L. Sullivan, and it's a humdinger of a fight, and it's really like every single fight scene, as I said, you enjoy it and you're anticipating the next one. There's also to me, maybe today rom-coms and other sorts of situation comedies have made us dull to the idea of what male-female attraction is. But in this film, Errol Flynn's character, as I said, Gentleman Jim, and the Alexis Smith character, who is this, I'm forgetting her name, but I know that she was she ended up giving him $10,000 for the side bet in order to make the money to be able to get to New Orleans. And she, of course, was always watching him through his rise, and sort of like loving him and hating him. And there's a scene towards the end of the film where Sullivan goes to the celebratory party, spoiler here, where Corbett beats him. And she sees that despite being a braggart, he was very kind to the former champ. And he says to him, 10 years ago, you probably would have beaten me. And it's an honor to take over the belt from you. And she saw the great spirit that he had, despite everything else, despite his desire for attention, despite the fact that he talked too much for his own good, that he was essentially a decent person who loved life. And she takes him out and says to him that, I know between us that you like me more than I like you, but I know that I love you more than you love me. And of course, we hear this a lot now, like and love, but I thought it was really done very sweetly towards the end of the film. And in a way, that's quite a subtle and important idea that many times people get on our nerves and they can't stand us, but yet we love them. And that's, I think, part of what, the idea here was, that we don't have to like everything about certain people, but we have to recognize that in many ways they are great. They are figures that push the envelope, that change things. And that's really part of what the film wants us to know about about Sullivan and Corbett. That Corbett was far from perfect, a ham, but his love of the sport and what he was about, whether this story is true or not, was essential for moving boxing into the era of the 1940s, where, of course, it actually reigned supreme as despite baseball, what they do in the film is deal with the fact that there's somebody at ringside who is actually using his telegraph to with the Morse code of the telegraph to send the messages of the fight. And of course, it lasted 21 rounds out of New Orleans, all over America. So I think it does in so many small and large ways. It gives you a sense of where America was and how America has come to be where it is. And you really walk out of the theater, if you were watching it, very, very impressed and smiling and hoping that, maybe this means something for Errol Flynn. Maybe he can do just more than put on a holster or take a saber, out of its scabbard. So, Yitzchok, what would you like to counter with here? What's your counterpunch to this?
Well, as you mentioned, I found it fascinating to learn in Jewish history, that American Jews who were from, like we know the story of All for the Boss, and that they actually they were big fans of boxing. That was the pastime. That was the spectator sport that was was adopted by the Orthodox Jewish community. It was popular to go see, which seems rather kind of strange to us today. I remember actually I had a book. One of my cousins, who's a Lubavitcher Chassid, gave me letters people wrote to Lubavitcher Rebbe, and someone was asking, I don't know, a bracha either. I don't know if he was a boxer or a wrestler, and the Rebbe wrote back, that it horrifies me so much that you're even asking such a thing. He was not happy about it, although I understand there's I think currently a boxer who's a Lubavitcher Chassid, who's a Shomer Shabbos, so it's not totally out of style, but it is something that was. But like you said, there's so many films about boxing and the history about boxing. And actually, I read that Shemp Howard actually died in a car coming. He had a heart attack coming back from a boxing match, and he had actually starred in a lot of short subjects of the Joe Palooka series. But mentioning Shemp, we know his brothers Mo and Curly. They were in. There was probably one of the most famous of the Three Stooges shorts with Curly was one called Punch Drunks, and I'm actually kind of reviewing it now, and it's been a little while since I'd seen it, but it's an interesting story how it started off. That you have, and it was actually somewhat immortalized in a Nintendo game, where there was this one of the scenes of the short was made into a game, which was kind of a challenge.
It is one of the most famous Stooges shorts. And this, of course, what happens is I think that Curly is somehow turned into this incredibly aggressive, successful boxer, but he needs to hear Pop Goes the Weasel, right? Isn't that
right? So they discover him. Mo is a boxing coach, and manager, and he has two of his guys who they're not doing so well, and he's at a restaurant, and Curly is a waiter at the restaurant, and Larry comes in to offer to play, get him some more business. So he goes and he starts playing his violin, which Larry actually, he learned to play the violin because when he was a child, he had burned his arm with some very dangerous acid, and his father saw he was about to drink this acid, would have killed him. His father knocked the acid out of his hand, but it wound up burning his hand. And the doctor said that the physical therapy that he should use to heal the arm that was burned was he should learn to play the violin. And that's how he became a violinist since he was a small child. And so anyway, in many of the episodes he plays the violin, but here he's playing the violin in the restaurant. He starts playing Pop Goes the Weasel, and somehow that triggers the waiter Curly. The three of them had no shaykhs before that in this episode, and then and Curly has some kind of a triggering event that he starts punching and acting very erratically. He doesn't know what's going on, and he knocks out these two world class boxers. So then Mo is convinced that and he explains this: if when I hear that Weasel tune, that I black out. I don't know what's going on. So they have some more experiences that they see a young woman has a flat tire, and again he plays the Pop Goes the Weasel, and it gives Curly some superhuman strength, and he's able to lift up the car so they can change the flat tire, and then finally they go to be in the in the boxing ring, and Larry's violin gets destroyed. So Larry has to run into town to go get a radio to try to play "Pop Goes the Weasel" for Mo and Curly, and that's actually the scene that we mentioned was made into a video game in the 1980s. It was a video game based on that scene where Larry is running back and forth to get this radio. So meanwhile, Curly is not prepared to fight, and he's getting beaten. And one of the cute things in the show is that there's this kid who keeps throwing his peanut.
So you can incredibly, it was almost 90 years ago, and it's still quite funny. I mean, and it really, a part of what's funny, of course, is the fact that Curly, unlike the very svelte and boxing like image that Errol Flynn showed in Gentleman Jim, Curly doesn't exactly look like a bruiser, right? He was short and squat, but how do you think Curly did in terms of the boxing scenes? Did it seem obviously very contrived? Did it look like he actually, could be a terror if you got him into it?
I mean, I think it's again, I'm not such a maven in boxing, so I don't know. I think he did a good job because he was a great pantomime, and that's really what it comes down to when you're making a film like this is the pantomime abilities more than anything. I mean, the truth is, a film that I'm a big fan of course, is the King Kong. The history behind that was that also Willis O'Brien.
It's like every single show we do eventually comes back to King Kong.
Yeah,
this is, I think, the 32nd. And of course, we've been doing this for a long time because this was our undercard to Stir with Love for about a year, and we've done 32 shows here. I would say of the 60 or so programs that we've done, I think King Kong has showed up in about 50% of them. But go ahead, yes, King Kong, weiter King Kong. Go ahead.
So when Willis O'Brien, was what he himself was a boxer. And he based a lot of his animation techniques on his own boxing, and that's why I'm bringing it up. Is that it's an art to to be able to, even if it's not authentic, but to be able to.
No. Obviously, you need choreography. You need it to be staged, and obviously, as Scorsese showed incredibly in Raging Bull, that the way the boxing filmed is crucial. It's a violent thing, and people in a way don't want to look away from someone getting punched in the face. So filming is crucial. It is like an artist sketching something on a palette. It has to be done in a fashion that is suggestive of a real boxing match, but also allows you to watch it and enjoy it. I think that I think part of the reason why the Stooges is there is because it is so funny, and I think it also taps into the zone boxers get into. Of course, Curly, when Curly becomes the boxing king, he sort of is not the same personality anymore. He's not the mild-mannered sort of doofus that was the waiter, right? But I think that part of that really taps into a boxer's success. boxers weren't necessarily, aggressive blowhards who would stamp on everything, but somehow they were able to channel through some sort of means the innate violent energy that all mankind has that we know we try to tame. Um, Obviously, Cain and Hevel, we talk about from the inception of human beings, we talk about the rivalry that leads to violence and possible death. I think part of the reason people were fascinated by boxing was because we took this primal energy and we were able to distill it and turn it into something that was somewhat of an art with rules. And I think that's part of the reason why people gravitated to it. And it's interesting, Yitzchak, because even if you weren't watching it, the descriptions, whether they were done by telegraph, like in Gentleman Jim, or by radio, would have people glued to their radios listening to a description of how the punches went back and forth. Obviously, it stirred in the imagination something primal and important, which I think is still there. Um, in ways that even a sword fight, which of course is another staple of films of the 30s and 40s, really doesn't manage. There aren't films today, swashbuckling films have been shunted to the wayside, but there's going to be another boxing film. Right? Boxing films are not going to go out of vogue because the idea of two people standing one against the other, just with pure strength, brain, and brawn together, I think that is something that everyone can be mesmerized by. And I think that's part, even though it's done in a very humorous way, I think that Punch Drunks has part of that. It's interesting.
To me, what stands out is the power of the trigger, because and the irrational power of the trigger. We have no idea why is it this song that triggers him, but we know it does, and that is something working with psychology, working with criminal justice and so forth. We see the destructive powers of triggers, and how here he was able to, I guess, somewhat like with that the Chazal say if someone was noiled b'mazel madamim, that they could either be a rotzeach or a moil, or like that type of thing. That he was able to somehow, in some sense, in a socially acceptable way, he was able to take that trigger and sublimate it for something. I don't know if I would say it's positive necessarily, but at least it's not.
By the way, Yitzchak, just
antisocial,
Yes, well, again, I think that we need to plumb the reason why this genre is so popular and still remains that way, whether it's watching these old films or coming up with new takes on it. And you can see, as many of the films I mentioned in the beginning really indicate. What's interesting, though, as I look at the description of this film, just checking my computer here, is that you mentioned how Larry gets a radio. It's not a radio. He actually commandeers a politician's campaign truck.
In the end, yeah. Well, first he gets the radio, and the radio doesn't.
Right, and he drives the truck back to the arena. And there's something really about that. It was usually played on the streets on barrel organs with senseless lyrics, supposedly. And they finally got some more wholesome lyrics to it. But I think it's what it means. I guess is open to yeah, you're right. It's a flat iron, and the weasel is a hatter's tool, and etc. But it definitely builds up to a certain excitement, right? Pop goes the weasel, right? So here you have that sense of I'm dancing around with you, and boom, and makes sense too. I also like the idea that it's such a popular ditty that it's used everywhere, and the politicians are using it, and taking the truck through the wall. It's also interesting that this was the only Stooges short that was preserved in the U.S. National Film Registry in the Library of Congress as being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. So that tells you something about about, I guess, although it's definitely not considered highbrow, but it's probably one of the better choices you could have made for a stooge film about this sport. Well, Yitzchak, again, obviously people can turn around and see many boxing types of stories. You mentioned, of course, how popular was Benny Leonard, of course, a famous Jewish boxer, and others. I do think that we have become more sensitive to the concussions. Whether it was Muhammad Ali, as the type of Parkinson's syndrome that affected him, and other boxers, as we've seen the way they become. So I think there's an undercurrent of disgust that you do find in our culture for this. I don't think people care that much today about boxing, and I think they do see it as sort of although again the movies are coming out, I don't know if the sport itself is really that popular outside of a number of people in Vegas and some places. I don't know if it has that type of. I don't know if kids are growing up today in America with posters of whoever the world heavyweight champion is today. Maybe in some areas, but clearly it's become somewhat out of vogue. But I think you might not want to watch it, some part of you, but if you are stuck in front of the screen and it's playing, 9 out of 10 people will probably stop and watch. And I think that, again, I think it really goes back to who we are.
I mean, I used to remember as a child, there was it Mike Tyson and Buster Douglas? Was it what was the name of the boxer that my mother said, oh, this is gonna, he's gonna just get knocked out, and I was like, I couldn't understand why it was this important.
Tyson in a way was a type of boxer, I think, that people really went back. That was in a way a throwback. Tyson captured people's imagination. That was in 1990.
But then Douglas knocked him out.
Douglas knocked him out, yes, and Tyson then became really a whole story about why he never developed into what possibly could have been one of the greatest boxers of all time. But again, Tyson's aggressiveness, Tyson's animalistic aspects that came out as he continued to fight really probably had a lot to do with the undoing of, or at least cementing the coffin of the boxing as the popular sport, or could it ever be? Ali, of course, was a very handsome and charismatic hero, and I think people were interested in him. George Foreman, in many ways, was very similar to James Corbett, in terms of being a media star as well. Anybody who's ever had the Foreman grill knows that he knew how to market himself. So again, it's always been a situation where you have to be light on your feet and strong with your arms, but also being able to exercise your mouth and to push your persona and be laced with enough charisma that people will actually care for you. And I think that's really part of what is, I think, probably the recipe for some of these successful boxers, whether we're talking about Joe Louis or Sugar Ray Leonard or Rocky Marciano or Rocky Graziano, of course, played by Paul Newman. And one of his, I think probably his breakout role, Paul Newman, Somebody Up There Likes Me. You might remember that film also from the 1950s, another boxing film. Well, I think the rounds are pretty much ended here. I hear the bell is going on. I'm willing to go down for the count on this one. But TKO in some way was achieved over here, as we suggest two possibilities that are out there from the 30s and 40s. And if it whets your appetite for more pugilistic excitement, there's plenty of places to turn. But I don't know if you're going to get anything as comedic and as fun as either of these two options. All right. Watch your step, guys, on the way out. Be careful over there. Take care. Don't get caught up in the ropes And we'll catch you next time. Be well.
Thanks for joining us for another episode from the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a single episode.